Hello, hello. Today I have a very old book that was one of my favorites just for the pictures. I loved these pictures, and you can see it's all taped up. It's from 1954, and it's the story of Cinderella, so I'm sure you've heard it before. You can see my copy is very fragile, but the pictures are beautiful, and I'm going to show them to you. It says it's an old-time favorite with new pictures. Retold by Evelyn Andres and pictures by Ruth Ives, and it was published in 1954, like I said. So here is one of the pictures. Beautiful Cinderella. I hope you enjoy it as much as I do, or did. They made her scrub and clean all day, and gave her only rags to wear. Once there was a girl who was as good as she was beautiful. She lived with her stepmother and two stepsisters. They were cruel to her because she was more beautiful than they were. They made her scrub and clean all day long and gave her only rags to wear. At night she slept in the chimney corner. Because she was always covered with ashes, they called her Cinder Wench or Cinderella. One day the king's son announced that a great ball was to be held at the palace. Cinderella's two stepsisters were invited. They were delighted and for days talked about nothing else. The stepsisters began to choose silks and laces for their ball gowns and jewels and feathers for their hair. "We will let you help us try on our dresses and fix our hair for us," one of the stepsisters said to Cinderella. Cinderella did her best to make her stepsisters look beautiful, but no matter how hard she tried, Cinderella still looked more beautiful than they, even in her rags. This made the stepsisters angry. "Why don't you go to the ball too, Cinderella?" the other stepsister asked. The poor girl looked down at her rags and said, "How I wish I could go." Then they laughed at her and said, "Imagine a cinder wench at the prince's ball." When the great night came, Cinderella was very busy helping the stepsisters dress for the ball. At last, the two stepsisters took one more look in the mirror and departed. Their silks rustled as they swept past Cinderella. With tears in her eyes, Cinderella watched them get into their coach. "Just the same, I wish I could go too," she whispered to herself. At that very moment, she heard a voice behind her saying, "And so you shall, my child." Who's behind her? Well, her fairy godmother. Swiftly, Cinderella turned around. There stood a lovely lady with a crown on her head and a wand in her hand. "I am your fairy godmother," she said to Cinderella, "and I shall help you go to the prince's ball. First, you must run into the garden and bring me the biggest pumpkin you can find." Cinderella ran happily into the garden to do the bidding of her fairy godmother. Cinderella searched for the finest and largest pumpkin. Finally, she picked one and took it back to the fairy godmother. "This is the best one in the garden," she said eagerly. The fairy godmother waved her wand over the pumpkin. Instantly it was changed into a splendid red coach with gold trimmings. "Now we need 6 horses for your coach," said the fairy godmother. "Run and fetch the mousetrap." Cinderella brought the mousetrap in which there were 6 lively little mice. "Lift up the trapdoor and let the mice out," said the fairy. As the mice ran out, the fairy waved her wand over them. The mice were changed into 6 prancing white horses. They had long manes and tails and wore purple tassels on their heads. "Now we need a coachman," said the fairy. "Bring the rat trap." Cinderella brought the rat trap, and with one big rat sitting in it. She opened the trap door, and as the rat ran out, the fairy waved her wand over it. The rat was changed into a handsome coachman, dressed in purple and gold livery. His coachman's hat was trimmed with a yellow plume, and on his feet he wore shiny black boots. The coachman bowed and then jumped up on the coach and took the reins in his hand. "You must go to the ball in style," said the fairy. "We will need footmen too." She thought for a moment and then said, "6 footmen will do. Run and fetch 6 green lizards." Cinderella hurried into the garden and brought back 6 green lizards. The fairy waved her wand, and instantly the 6 green lizards were changed into 6 tall footmen. They too were dressed in purple livery with gold trimmings. "There," said the fairy to Cinderella with a twinkle in her eye, "you have a coachman fit for a queen. Are you happy now?" Cinderella looked down at her rags. "How can I go to the prince's ball dressed in these rags?" she murmured, and the tears rose to her eyes again. The fairy godmother laughed gently and touched Cinderella with her wand. Cinderella's rags fell away, and in their place was a magnificent ball gown of golden silk trimmed with pink roses. She had white gloves on her arms and diamonds in her hair, and on her feet twinkled 2 lovely little glass slippers. Cinderella looked very beautiful indeed. "And now off to the ball," said the fairy godmother. "But you must remember that the magic ends at midnight. If you are not home by that time, you will find that you have no coach and footmen, and you will be dressed in rags again." Cinderella promised her fairy godmother to be home by 12 o'clock. Then she entered her splendid coach and rode off to the ball, her face shining with happiness. When Cinderella arrived at the ball, everyone turned to stare at her. "How beautiful she is," some whispered. "I wonder who she is," said others. Everyone thought that she was a great princess from a faraway land, and no one dreamed that she was a little cinder wench. Even Cinderella's 2 stepsisters did not recognize her, but they were very envious of her beauty. "The prince dances with no one but her," they said to each other. Indeed, Cinderella and the prince were the handsomest couple on the dance floor. As they danced, Cinderella's jewels and glass slippers gleamed in the light of 1,000 candles. The prince was enchanted with this lovely girl, whom he had never seen before, and he never left her side. When supper was served, the prince picked out the choicest fruits and cakes for Cinderella. Then he took her by the hand and led her to the king and queen. He told them that he loved her. Cinderella was so happy that she quite forgot about the time. What time is she supposed to leave? 12 o'clock, midnight. But the last hour of the magic was drawing to a close. Suddenly, Cinderella heard the palace clock sound the first note of 12 o'clock. Dong! She remembered what her fairy godmother had told her. Quickly, she curtsied to the prince and hurried out of the ballroom. Outside the palace, she fled down the marble steps to the gate, and in her hurry, Cinderella lost one of her glass slippers on the marble steps of the palace. The coach was still waiting outside the palace gates, but just as Cinderella reached it, the last note of midnight sounded. The coach vanished before her very eyes, and there on the ground lay the pumpkin. Instead of coachman and 6 white horses, the rat and mice scurried off. In place of the 6 footmen, the lizards crawled away in the dust, and Cinderella stood there dressed in rags again. One little glass slipper was all that remained of Cinderella's finery and of her wonderful evening at the ball. Quietly, Cinderella limped home. She reached her chimney corner just before her sisters returned from the ball. Quickly, before they could become angry with her again, she tucked the lovely little glass slipper away in her pocket. The prince visited. I turned too many pages. The next morning, everyone was awakened by the sound of a bugle. When they looked out the windows and doors, they saw a messenger from the palace on a horse. The messenger called out the news that the prince had found the glass slipper. He was determined to find the lovely girl who had worn it the night before at his ball. The prince himself would visit every house in the kingdom, and when he found the girl who had worn the glass slipper, she would become his bride. Of course, all the young ladies in the kingdom were very excited. They hurried to put on their finest dresses and to look their best for the prince's visit. Cinderella's two stepsisters dressed up too. But Cinderella had nothing to wear except for rags. The prince visited every house in the kingdom. At last he came to Cinderella's house. Cinderella's stepsisters pushed her aside in their hurry to try on the slipper. "I think it will fit me," said the older girl. But she could not even squeeze her toes into the tiny slipper. The younger stepsister had no better luck when she tried the slipper on her foot. Cinderella was sitting in her chimney corner while the stepsisters tried the slipper on. Suddenly the prince noticed her sitting there. He looked for a long time at her lovely face, and he knew that he had seen that face before. "Would you like to try the slipper on?" he asked her. "Yes, I would," said Cinderella shyly. "You," said the stepsisters, "go back into your cinders and ashes where you belong." But the prince would not listen to the stepsisters. "Let her try the slipper on," he insisted. Cinderella slipped her foot into the glass slipper easily. There was a moment of surprised silence. Then, to everyone's amazement, she drew the other slipper out of her pocket and put it on her foot. At that very moment, Cinderella's fairy godmother appeared. She touched Cinderella with her wand. Instantly, all Cinderella's rags fell away, and she stood there dressed again in her splendid golden ball gown. The stepsisters were so astonished that they could not say a word, but the prince was delighted. He gazed at Cinderella with joy and then knelt down at her feet. "This is my own true bride," he said, and he kissed her hand. There was great rejoicing throughout the whole kingdom. The wedding feast lasted for 3 days and 3 nights. Cinderella was so happy that she forgave her stepsisters. She took them to live with her at the palace. There they married 2 lords and became court ladies. And the prince and Cinderella lived happily ever after. I wonder if you've ever heard this retelling. You might have seen the movie or read some other books, but this retelling is a little bit different, and I really like this retelling. And I love that Cinderella forgave her wicked stepsisters, and they were so cruel to her, but she was kind to them, and then she blessed them in the end by bringing them to the palace, and they got married, and they lived happily ever after. Hope you have a great day. And I hope you love the pictures in this book as much as I did.